And before we really get going this evening, I would like to give a special shout out and hello to Jillian Murphy, the new director for Elting Memorial Library. If you want to give a wave, Jillian, I would just like to welcome her. This is your first official program with the library. So we are open now for appointments and you can come in and browse. And if you want to come say hi to Jillian, feel free to do so. All right, so tonight we have presenting Spring on the Hudson, Steve Stanne. You might know him. He did a number of musical story times with us back when we were in lockdown. He performed with us for Music in the Garden with Betty and the Baby Boomers. I happen to know him especially well. He's my father. So I'm very happy he agreed to do this program for us at the library. He has taught about the Hudson for the Hudson River Clearwater and the Hudson River Estuary program for over 40 years. He is also the lead author of a recently published 3rd edition of the Hudson, an Illustrated Guide to the Living River from Rutgers University Press. It's incredible. The pictures are now in color. We hope to get a copy at the library soon, so you can come and check it out if you're interested. So with that, I'm going to hand it over. You can hear our dog in the background. I'm going to hand it over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I always enjoy talking about the Hudson, and I see friends from around the world tonight, from all around New York, from New England, even from Japan. It's great to see so many people interested in the river and checking in tonight. It is a lovely spring day out there, so my talk will be about spring on the Hudson tonight. And I welcome you to ask questions or make comments about it, put them in chat. We'll save some time at the end of the program so that we'll try to answer the questions that you have. And so save them and put them in chat. We'll get them, and Margaret will keep track of them there. I'm going to share my screen and get started. Okay, by the way, I should say that while most of the pictures in this show will be mine, many are from other photographers who have graciously given me permission to show the images. I've tried to put a note on all of them so they're recognized. If I missed someone, please excuse me. But I really appreciate the gift of their art and their skill as photographers. So I'm going to talk about spring on the Hudson tonight, mainly about that period of time between the vernal equinox and the start of summer in June. And before I get into the specifics of spring, I always like to give people a few general pointers about how the Hudson works. So I'm going to start with that. As most of you know, the Hudson is an arm of the sea. There are various influences that enter the Hudson through lower New York Bay and upper New York Harbor under the Verrazano Bridge and work their way up the Hudson, making it an estuary. One of them that's pretty obvious, particularly in the winter, which just got past, is the fact that there are tides in the river. And that shows itself in two ways. One, the tidal currents, the currents of the river, switch directions about every 6 hours. For 6 hours, as you can see in this picture here, they might be flowing upstream, away from the ocean. This is a photo taken from the walkway over the Hudson. And you can see that marker, that channel marker in the lower part of the picture. If you look at the eddies from that marker, you can see that the current is headed up towards the top of the picture. 6 hours later, it's going in the opposite direction. Our Native Americans had various names for the river, but one of them was Mahicantuk, spelled various names, various ways, which means, roughly speaking, very loosely translated, the river that flows both ways. Now, in addition to the back and forth of the currents influenced by tides, we also have the tide itself, the rise and fall of the tide. There's the Mid-Hudson Bridge in Poughkeepsie. If you've ever been down to Warriors Park in Poughkeepsie, you may have seen this site. And again, if you hang around there, maybe having dinner at the restaurants nearby or just walking along the river, you'll see a definite change over time as the tide rises and falls. And this tidal action extends up the Hudson River all the way to the dam at Troy, the first barrier across the river. And again, if you were to hang out here for any length of time, you would see the tide rising and falling even here about 150 miles north of the tip of Manhattan and the Statue of Liberty. Now, Margaret warned me not to show too many graphs tonight, but that's part of my shtick. I think it's really important that people understand graphs, and I don't want them to scare you. They just tell a story. They're one more way of telling a story, just as a newspaper article or a TV show or anything else, and you just have to learn to interpret them. This is a fairly straightforward one that shows the tide cycle in the Hudson, the ups and downs that I just showed you at Poughkeepsie. And so when you look at a graph, I want you to look at where it's made or what the place is that it's showing. And in this case, you can see that it is Poughkeepsie. You want to look at the period of time, in this case, that it's showing. And this is actually about the last week or so. Actually, the last few days, I should say, since the 16th. And what is it actually graphing? It's graphing the height of the tide, the height of the water at Poughkeepsie. And you can see that it rises and falls. And if you look at this is actually the 16th through the 17th. So I chose about 2 days over the last week. And you can see that over those 2 days, there are 4 high tides, 2 each day, and 3 low tides. The other one is out of sight on the graph. But you can see the general movement of the tides here. It goes up and down roughly every 6 hours, a little more than 6 hours. Now I'm going to confuse you a little bit. I'm going to add a graph of the tides at Albany for the same period of time. And you can see that they're different. And there are actually 2 main differences that I usually point out. There's a third too, but it's pretty subtle. And I don't know that I'll get into it tonight. But if you look carefully, you can see that the tides in Albany are first more extreme than the tides in Poughkeepsie. They are typically higher and also usually lower, but not the case this time because this is spring and there's a lot of water coming into the Hudson. So actually the river at Albany is a little bit higher than the river in Poughkeepsie. And that's shown in this graph. For those of you who are real Hudson River freaks, I'll say, you'll also notice that as the tide is falling, it takes longer for the tide to fall than it does to go up, and that's because there is more water coming down the river at this time of year. So that extends the time of the falling tide. Now I know this is a tough graph, but not really. This shows a month of time. Again, this happens to be a March period, but it's about a month. And I chose to show this graph because many of you have heard the term spring tides, and this is a program about spring. Well, it turns out that spring tides have nothing to do with the season of the year. Instead, they have to do with how high and low the tides are. And this graph is essentially the same one I just showed you, that is a graph of the tidal cycles, but it shows tide cycles for about 28 days, almost 30 days. So you're seeing a lot of up and down instead of just the 2 days worth. But the thing to notice about this, there's a bunch of things to notice, but I'll make it simple. At some times in the month, the high and low tides are less extreme. They're less different than they are at other times of month. And you can see here, for example, when the moon is in its quarter phase, last quarter in this case, the tides are not quite as extreme as they are when you have a new moon, when the moon is not visible. And if I move to the next point in the graph where the tides are not extreme, this is the first quarter, you can see that there's only about 2 feet's difference between the high and the low tide at this point, as opposed to 6 feet at the new moon. And if you wanted to predict what would happen on the full moon, I'll let you guess. That's another extreme tide. And that is because the sun and the moon are in line with the earth at the time of new moon and full moon, whereas the sun and moon are at right angles to the earth when you see a quarter moon. And that, of course, the sun and the moon have gravitational effects on the earth and on the oceans. That's what drives the tides. And when they're lined up, as they are in the case of the new moon and the full moon, the tides are more extreme. They're higher and lower because there's more gravitational action happening at that point, more gravitational attraction. No more graphs for a while. The other effect of the ocean that I want to point out, that many of you probably are familiar with, is that the Hudson, being an estuary, is a mix of fresh and salt water, and the salt water pushing in from the ocean. And that means that in part of the river, you're going to see zebra mussels, which are a freshwater organism, and largemouth bass, which are a freshwater organism. And in the lower part of the Hudson, you might see bluefish coming in from the ocean, and you'll see barnacles on the rocks. Or down in New York Harbor, you'll see various seaweeds as well. And in the middle, you might find them both. If you go down to New Windsor, to the Cowaweesee Unique area, the park at Plum Point, just south of Newburgh, and you pick up a rock there in the summertime, you might find both zebra mussels and barnacles on the rock because of the mix of salt and fresh that occurs there. This chart gives you a sense of the extremities of the movement of the leading edge of salt water. It's called the salt front, but you might not be able to taste the difference. You probably couldn't, at least not the way the U.S. Geological Service measures it, and they're the ones who tell us where the salt front is. But you can detect it with instruments, and typically in spring at this time of year, the salt front would be down at the Tappan Zee. By summer, it's going to be up maybe around Newburgh Bay, typically. But when you talk about the Hudson, often the exception is more the rule than the generalities. And when you have extreme weather events like Tropical Storm Irene, the runoff, the fresh water coming from the rainfall of those storms pushed the salt all the way down to New York Harbor. The entire river down to New York Harbor was fresh. Whereas when we have droughts, for example, in the fall of 1995, the leading edge of dilute salt water, the salt front, reached Hyde Park. And again, what controls the position of the salt front is the amount of runoff, the amount of fresh water coming into the Hudson from its watershed. This is a picture of Coho's Falls on the Mohawk River. The Mohawk is the largest tributary of the Hudson. And this is what you might see at this time of year, with a lot of melting snow, a fair amount of rainfall at this time of year. So there's a good amount of water coming over the falls. Whereas at other times of year, in the summer in particular, there's less water coming over, less fresh water entering the estuary, and that allows the salt front to push further north. One more graph here. This is a graph that was made at West Point, and it's actually from last year. What I wanted to show you is how the salt front does, how the salt starts to creep up the river. This is a graph of salinity, and there is a sensor at West Point that measures the salinity of the water. And you can see through April and early May, there's no salinity to speak of, not at all, really, it's zero. But around the middle of May, it starts to creep up. There's an up and down every day as the tide moves the salt back and forth in front of the sensor. And eventually, with not much rainfall, and as we get into June and into July, the salt concentration grows there at West Point, and the salt front itself pushes up towards Newburgh, or maybe points even further north. So, pardon the dog, he's all of us have shut our doors to watch shows or give shows tonight, so the dog is unhappy. This picture here is taken by the U.S. Coast Guard. They make regular flights up and down the river during the winter months to check on the condition of the ice. As you can see here, this was a winter when there wasn't much, and it's towards the end of the winter, so the ice is melting as temperatures gradually increase. So through February or so, the temperature in the river here at Norrie Point over in Hyde Park in Staatsburg is pretty much at freezing, 32 degrees. But as the water warms up, as the air temperature warms up, and as the land warms up and water runs off the land, warmer water comes off the land, the temperature starts to go up, so that by this time of year, it might be up to about 50 degrees or so. And that temperature increase controls a lot of what happens in the Hudson in the spring. Now, a lot of what you see in the river is invisible. A lot of the things that spring brings about in the Hudson, you can't see it because the water's rather turbid, rather muddy. On land, of course, we see birds coming. We see flowers like the Hepatica blooming. So what can we look for in the river that tells us that things are starting to warm up and life is getting pretty active out there? Well, we're not going to see flowers blooming, but there certainly are plants or plant-like organisms that are starting to grow and increase in number in the Hudson around this time of year. One of the most important are little single-celled organisms called algae, or more properly, grouping them together, phytoplankton. They drift in the water. Plankton means drifters. And these phytoplankton drift out there, becoming essentially the pastures of the Hudson. But if you can't see them, they might impart a little bit of greenish color to the water, but you can't really see them. Other things might be starting to grow at this time of year, but are hidden in the muddy water. The rooted vegetation of the water of the Hudson, which we call submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV for short. Now, this is a pretty lush bed, and this picture was actually taken in the summer. It won't be that lush until we get to July or so, but it'll start to poke its head up in the spring. And one of the ways you know that the plants are growing active in the river is that they start to photosynthesize. And if you remember your high school science classes, photosynthesis involves plants taking sunlight and using it as the energy source to create the food they need to grow. In the process, they release oxygen. Now, this graph here it's at Tivoli South Bay, which is over in Tivoli. It's a flat area of the river enclosed by the railroad tracks. And if you look at the early part in April of this graph, which shows dissolved oxygen, you can see that there's about as much oxygen as there should be, about 100% of what should be out there. There's a little bit of variation, but it's pretty, it doesn't change much as you go through the day. But notice as you get to May, the days get longer, the weather warms up, and those plants start photosynthesizing. And as they do, they produce a lot of oxygen. So you can see that the oxygen peaks every day start to get really high and then really low overnight as they stop photosynthesizing and they use up oxygen like other living things do. So they're producing a lot of oxygen. This is the middle of the day, the middle of the afternoon, probably a peak of oxygen production as the sun beats down on the water and the photosynthetic machinery starts whirring in these cells and in plants. But what's interesting here, notice how it falls off as you get into June, and you don't see those peaks anymore. Matter of fact, you see the peaks going down, which means oxygen is being used up. Matter of fact, there's only about half the oxygen that should be in this water as you get into June. One of the things I like to look at in these graphs is to try to figure out what do they tell you, what's going on in the river. And in this case, what's going on is that there's another plant involved. Now I've put a little line and it shows you the 100% level. You can see how it increases in May and into June and then falls off well below 100%. What's going on? Water chestnut. Those of you who have traveled along the river have probably seen the dense beds of this floating leaved organism. And like all plants, it photosynthesizes. But unlike the plants that we just looked at, water chestnut releases its oxygen not into the water, but into the air. And underneath it, it's so dark because of this dense growth that plants cannot photosynthesize. Even the algae have a hard time photosynthesizing down there. So in places like the Tivoli South Bay, where there's a lot of water chestnut, dissolved oxygen levels go down under those beds. And that'll start happening later in the spring. This plant, this is actually, again, a picture taken in the height of its summer growth, but you'll start to see the leaves coming to the surface late in May and in June, and then they'll just increase in number and density until in some places like this place at the Sopus Meadows, they'll cover the shallow waters. Some signs of what's going on in the river are a little more obvious. This is a shad bush. Now, it has actually no direct connection to what's going on in the river. However, the folks who settled the Hudson Valley called it the shad bush for a reason. It has other names in other parts of the country, serviceberry, for example. But what's happening here is that as it happens, this shrub blooms at the same time as the American shad comes up the river. And shad was traditionally one of the main food fish from the river. It was the mainstay of the commercial fishing industry on the river. It's the scientific name for the shad is Alosa sapidissima, herring most delicious. Now, the Native Americans had another name for it, which translated meant porcupine fish turned outside in. It has a lot of bones. One of my ichthyologist friends once spent an afternoon counting the bones in the shad, and the number came out to be about 750. But it's still pretty delicious, especially if you can find boned shad. Expert fishmongers were able to get all the bones out and present you with a slab of fish that is free of bones, and it's quite delicious. Indeed, herring most delicious. Now, the shad fishing industry used to be one of those signs of springs on the river. If you were driving over the Mid-Hudson Bridge, you might see shad fishermen drift netting. It was a small-scale industry, not any of the large trawlers or other huge nets that you see on ocean-going boats these days. But people went out in rowboats. They would set a net out to drift along the Hudson, south of the bridge or north of the bridge, wait a few hours, and then start hauling in the shad. And the arrival of the shad used to be celebrated with shad festivals, in which Chris Letts here from the Hudson River Foundation would set up a fire pit and get out some oak planks, nail some fillets of shad and some bacon across them, and then serve up servings of the shad to anybody who wanted to come down. And the shad fishing industry was actually, not like producing cars or anything like that, not that sort of major industry, but still it employed a lot of people seasonally along the river. This photo from the Hudson River Maritime Museum shows a shad fishing camp in probably in the Esopus area, Port Ewan area. And you can see there were quite a few people out there catching shad. It was the mainstay of, as I said, of the commercial fishing, and it was a good spring meal was shad roe, the eggs of the shad, which are the most valuable part, asparagus, fresh asparagus, and maybe some new potatoes as well. That's a great spring meal in my estimation. Unfortunately, shad are not doing very well. This is a young shad, and the Department of Environmental Conservation goes out each summer to see how the fish are doing, and particularly to measure the numbers of young fish. These shad and other fish come into the Hudson in the spring, mainly on their spawning runs. They come in to lay eggs. They don't necessarily want, but they've evolved a life cycle that has them coming into the river because the Hudson is a wonderful nursery. And the river in the summer is full of young shad, young stripers, young herring, all sorts of young fish. in what is great nursery habitat. So the DEC goes out each summer and catches a number of different species, but they focus particularly on the shad, and they're looking for the young fish to measure how well the reproduction, how good reproduction was in the spring. And you can't really count the numbers of fish in the river, but if you do this sort of sampling every year in the same places and in the same way, you can come up with a comparison from year to year that shows you how well the shad population is doing. The story is not well. The yellow line or the yellow-green line here is sort of the level at which the population reproduction would allow the population to increase and to maintain itself. And you can see that since 2001, it hasn't been able to do that. And the numbers of young shad captured each year have not been very high. There was a good year well, not good in historical terms, in 2014, but above that replacement level. And so the hope was that we'd see a lot of adult shad coming back 5 years later or so, but that didn't happen. And in fact, production of young 4 and 5 years later was not very good either. So that didn't materialize. Basically, because of this drop-off that you see here, shad fishing is no longer allowed in the Hudson. The fisheries were closed. Both, when I say fisheries, I mean both the commercial netting fishery and sport fishing for shad, just because the numbers are so low. The thing is that the fact that the numbers are low may not have much to do with fishing here in the Hudson. One of the things you got to remember about these fish is that we think of them as our fish. Here they come in April, May. These are our fish returning. Well, yeah, they're coming in to spawn, but they're just as much the fish of the Delaware and Massachusetts and Maine, because when they leave the Hudson in June, they're going to go out to the ocean and start migrating along the coast. Shad have sort of a migration that some of us may have envy. In the summer, they head up to the cool waters in the Gulf of Maine, up to Maine and Nova Scotia. And as the waters get cold in the fall, towards fall, they come south, off the Carolinas perhaps. And then as the water's warm in the spring, they come back up along the coast and enter the Hudson. While they're out there, they are being fished. They're fished in the Delaware. They were fished offshore. So that what we think of as our shad, a Delaware fisherman might think of as his shad. And so they're out there catching the fish. And in fact, the fish have been overfished out in the ocean. Not so much the adult fish these days. They're not allowed to fish for adults in the open ocean anymore. But the young fish are virtually indistinguishable from other sorts of herring that are found out there. And so the large ships do net lots and lots of young herring, and it's thought that that may be impacting our shad populations. Now, I mentioned that there is a sport fishery on the Hudson, and in spring, the Hudson sprouts boats. Folks get out there with their big nets and their hundreds of dollars worth of fishing gear. They're not primarily after shad, however. They're after striped bass. There's quite I hesitate to call it an industry, but there's quite a bit of value to the sport fishery for striped bass on the Hudson. And you can see why. They're big fish. They reward the angler with a tough fight. They're delicious to eat. They were caught commercially. The commercial fishery for striped bass ended because as predators, they tended to build up a fair amount of PCBs in their flesh, but that's a story for another time. Again, they come in about the same time as the shad, and are caught, as I said, by sport fishermen. The commercial fishery for striped bass ended many years ago because of PCBs. Doing the same sorts of surveys in the summer, looking at the young fish and looking at the graph, you can see that striped bass have, there's been a lot of ups and downs. They're generally doing all right, but recently, until this year, there was concern about too many of the female spawners being caught by hook and line fishermen. So DEC has instituted rules that will minimize the mortality of these fish when they're caught by using kind of hook called a circle hook that isn't as damaging to the fish. They can be released without so many of them suffering injuries. They also set new size limits for the striped bass to protect the fish. So stripers, there's still a fair number out there, but they have to be watched carefully and managed carefully to maintain the population. Now, one of the most celebrated fish of the river that comes in the spring is the Atlantic sturgeon. And this is a mural from the post office in Hyde Park. Hyde Park was the center of the Atlantic sturgeon fishing industry on the river. And of course, artists will take license. They'll make things brighter, more beautiful, bigger, perhaps, than they really are. But sturgeon are pretty big. This is about an 8-foot Atlantic sturgeon caught near Hyde Park. They can get bigger. A few years ago, some scientists were doing survey work using side scan sonar out on the river, very high resolution sonar. And they were able to detect some average size adult sturgeon, average being 6 to 8 feet, but they found one that was 14 feet long. The scientists who were out there trying to catch the sturgeon and tag them, of course, echoed the line from Jaws, "We need a bigger boat." So those are pretty rare these days, but they're out there. And the 8-foot ones are still pretty impressive. Now, again, we study sturgeon by catching the young ones. Actually, it's this time of year, the DEC fisheries biologists go out on Haverstraw Bay, and they set nets to catch young sturgeon. The sturgeon, unlike shad and striped bass, shad, when they're born in the Hudson, they spend the spring and summer in the Hudson, and in the fall, they go out to the ocean. Striped bass, they actually take about 2 years to get out to the ocean, and some stay in the river. Sturgeon might spend 5 years, maybe some of them 7 years in the river before they head out to the ocean. So the DEC biologists net the juvenile sturgeon. As you can see, here's a young one, just a couple of feet long, in Haverstraw Bay. Now, this one, although again, there's a lot of natural variation in the numbers of fish, but you can see that even though last year wasn't as good as the years before, in general, the numbers have been going up. They on average, they catch about twice as many fish now as they did when they started this work. So here's hoping that the Atlantic sturgeon story is a more successful one than shad. The Atlantic sturgeon were down to very low numbers back in the early 1990s, again because of overfishing. And this time it was in the Hudson itself. The people were catching them in the Hudson. And if you catch the large female sturgeon, mainly for their eggs to make caviar, then you aren't going to have any babies. So the DEC closed the fishery in the late 1990s and is starting to study the return of these fish. And you can see that the young ones are increasing. That means there are females coming in and spawning successfully. One of the sights you may see if you visit tributaries of the Hudson at this time of year is this net sitting in the tributaries. This one happens to be in the Fallkill Creek next to the Children's Museum in Poughkeepsie, right below the walkway over the Hudson. And these nets are set there to catch another migratory fish. However, this one has the opposite life cycle of the shad, the sturgeon, and the striped bass, which come in as adults to lay their eggs in fresh water. The eggs that this fish lays are laid in the Atlantic Ocean in a place called the Sargasso Sea, and the fish we see entering the Hudson after they've hatched from their eggs are the very young of the species. I'm going to show you a video here. Hopefully this was taken on a phone, and it starts off above the water. It's taken at the Quasaic Creek, but the phone's going to plunge into the water in a minute, believe it or not. And you can see that there are these little wiggling things heading, there we go. These are the young of the American eel. These are what are called glass eels. They're quite translucent. And they have made a 1,000-mile journey from the Sargasso Sea between Bermuda and Puerto Rico. The Bermuda Triangle, essentially, is where they're hatched. And they drift in the Gulf Stream and swim and enter freshwater streams along the Hudson as these tiny little, nearly transparent glass eels. And this, of course, you may be familiar with the adults. I'm not going to say too much about these because on Sunday, as Margaret mentioned earlier, there's going to be a whole program about these, about this program, about the eels, and about the citizen science project which studies these eels. And it's something that, at least when we get past COVID, any of you could become involved in as a volunteer. The nets have to be checked every day, and you might find no young eels. You might find hundreds. On some occasions, we find thousands of them that have come into the net overnight. And I believe that the record for an overnight catch of these glass eels was over 10,000 in one 24-hour period. A lot of counting. It took them hours to count those fish. And there's what they look like. Again, I could tell you a whole lot about eels, but we'll save that. Come back on Sunday. They're an incredibly interesting fish. Their life history, and going down and participating in the eel project really connects you to the Hudson and to the water in a way that's unique. You really start to learn a lot about what's in the streams and in the Hudson in doing this program. And they are cute, I think. Another fish that comes into the tributaries at the same time as the young eel are herring. This is a photo taken in the Black Creek over in the town of Esopus. The DEC is studying herring runs in this creek. It's pretty amazing how many herring can come in. In some years, they see nearly 500,000 fish come in. They actually put a counter in the stream. All the fish have to go through a gate that electronically counts the fish going through. And there was, in 2014, they had over 500,000 fish go through, most of them herring. Also at this time of year, a little bit later, maybe late May, early June, as you can see, the water chestnut is starting to sprout up in this picture. And many people will call me up or email me and say, what are these fish I see thrashing around? Are those striped bass? Are they sturgeon? Unfortunately, no, but they're big fish. These are carp, common carp, and this is the spawning behavior of the carp. The females go into the weeds, the eggs are dispersed in the weeds, and as they swim along, extruding the eggs, males swim up over their backs, thrashing over the backs of the females to fertilize them, and you see this white water exploding all over the beds of water chestnut. This was taken at Norrie Point, but you can see it at Esopus Meadows as well. And there's the adult carp. These are not, by the way, the Asian carp that we're all worried might get into the Hudson one of these days. However, they are a non-native fish. They were brought over, and actually, we believe the first stocking in the U.S. was in, I think, maybe the 1830s in Newburgh, New York. And of course, now they're found widely throughout the U.S. Now, following these fish into the river each spring are various predators. And one of the most interesting ones are the various species of seal that comes into the river. The most common is the harbor seal. They tend to follow those runs of herring. Shad fishermen would tell stories about pulling up nets and finding chunks taken out of the fish caught in their nets, chunks taken out by seals. However, other species do enter the river. This is actually a photo taken down in New York City of a harp seal. And if you are a reader of the Hudson River Almanac, more on that later, you may have seen reports of a harp seal being seen in the Highlands just a few weeks ago. And there is a harbor seal that's been hanging around the Saugerties Lighthouse for over a year now. I guess it likes the neighborhood, but it's pretty regularly seen there. I don't know why it's staying in the Hudson. A few years ago, a gray seal made it all the way up through the locks and into the canal, the Champlain Canal, and had to be rescued from a lock as it shut down for the winter. So these are, but again, these seals are most commonly seen in the late winter, early spring, following the fish migrations up the river. Overhead, of course, there's all sorts of things to see. And these, another sign that the fish are there are eagles carrying fish to their young. Now, the eagle is a fish that, a bird that depends largely on fish. And it's a great comeback story. For 100 years, there were no eagles born along the Hudson River. Matter of fact, in all of New York State, we were down by the 70s, down to the 70s or 80s, down to one pair of nesting eagles out in the central part of the state, and that pair was infertile. The cause was pesticides, notably DDT, which led to very either infertility or very thin eggshells, which when the mother birds tried to incubate the eggs, the shells would break. And that influenced many fish-eating birds in particular, and also other predatory birds at the tops of food chains. So the DEC, looking at the habitat along the Hudson, decided that it was a good place to try and reintroduce eagles. So what they did was to build towers and put artificial nests in those towers, and they brought in very young eaglets from other places around the country, and they put them in these nests, and then they would feed them in a way which didn't allow the young birds to see their human food providers. But it was hoped that the young eagles would imprint upon the area in which they grew up and return to nest in that area. And through the mid-1990s, there were some attempts to nest that were unsuccessful, but finally in 1997, up in around the border of Albany and Greene counties, a bird that had been born of that what's called a hacking program, that introduction program, had a successful nest, and this is the eaglet that was born, the first eaglet born along the Hudson in over 100 years, and its birth announcement made it to the front page of the New York Times. Since then, eagles have become almost commonplace. There are about 24 nests along the estuary itself. Here in New Paltz, it's not uncommon to see eagles flying overhead here. One perched in my neighbor's yard last winter. It's really an amazing comeback story. And it's in the young eagles hatch out in early March. They keep growing. They actually get a little bit bigger than their parents. The longer wings, the wider wingspan helps them when they first take wing as a fledgling. And so we've seen a real increase in the population of bald eagles along the Hudson and throughout New York State, thanks to that pioneering effort that DEC started back in decades ago. The osprey hasn't needed any help. They took a while to come back. The eagles were nesting on the river, but ospreys moved through as migrants. Didn't nest very often, however. But in the last few years, that's changed. We now see the fish hawk, as it's called, nesting on navigation towers along the river. One of the more interesting nests, and ospreys are sort of famous for putting nests in weird places. There is an osprey nest on a cell tower overlooking the Croton train station. A drone shot here showing that particular nest. Another success story is that of the peregrine falcon. Again, a bird that was impacted by DDT. They used to nest in a number of historic eyries, they're called, nest sites on the Palisades and in the Highlands, in the Gunks. But they disappeared as a nesting bird, again, because of pesticide poisoning. And the same techniques were used to bring them back. Again, bringing young birds in, putting them in artificial nests, and hoping that they would imprint upon the area that they've come back to and would come back as breeding adults. That's worked pretty well. Here's one of the more notable nests. It turns out now that there are peregrine falcon nests on all of the bridges across the Hudson River, from the Route 20 bridge in Albany, the Dunn Memorial Bridge, to the George Washington Bridge. As a matter of fact, the metropolitan New York area has one of the largest urban populations of peregrine falcons in the world. However, this is a picture taken by the New York State Thruway Authority of the new Tappan Zee Bridge, the Mario Cuomo Bridge. And you can see this tray that's set out here with a hole in the tower of the bridge here. That is where there were peregrine falcons nesting on the old bridge. They had to move the nest box to the new bridge, which they did, and the birds moved to the new site. And this is a picture actually of a neighbor of ours in New Paltz, Chris Nadareski, who is the person who has to climb up those towers and ban the young birds. And here he is facing off with an adult peregrine on the top of the Tappan Zee Bridge, and you can see the young ones cowering over in the corner there. I'll point out that if you'd like to see how these birds are doing, there are webcams that allow you to see these. This is one that I took a shot a few days ago of the webcam for the Tappan Zee nest. This is from April 18th. And you can see that the peregrine, this adult bird, is incubating eggs. It'll be a few more days probably before the young hatch out, but then you can see them grow and finally become adult peregrines, terrorizing the bird life of the river. This is a young peregrine falcon chasing or at least harassing, I don't know if it actually caught this, a green heron. And again, a great success story. If you are on the walkway over the Hudson, keep an eye out, because the birds that nest on the Mid-Hudson Bridge, there's also a webcam for those birds. The adults often fly by the walkway, and you might just see them zipping by while you're up there. Now, the peregrine's not a bird that actually depends on the water, but it is a bird that's found along the river, and it's a great story. However, these birds that I show you now are birds that depend on the water, waterfowl. Again, these are birds that are present at the end of the winter and catch food by diving among the ice floes. They stay on, moving north as the ice melts in the winter. The first and one of the most striking is the common merganser. Another one, the really cute little bird, the bufflehead. The canvasback, a really handsome bird. I've seen sometimes hundreds at the Esopus Meadows in the shallows there. They feed, their common name matches the scientific name of that SAV, that underwater grass that I showed you before, Vallisneria. And scaup, you see great rafts, as we call them, great flocks of scaup. Now, most of these birds will be around in the early spring, but then they'll move north, and they don't nest in the Hudson Valley, with one exception. The common merganser doesn't nest on the river, but it will nest in the Catskills and on some of the trout streams and things that are found in this area. Matter of fact, this picture was taken on the Ashokan Reservoir. I don't think that this mother had all of those little mergansers in one in one nest. If the young birds will probably will sometimes join together, and as is the case, I think the person who took this picture, I can't remember his name right now, but I believe he counted 27 little mergansers following the mom here on the Ashokan. Other waterfowl, of course, Canada geese flying over. There is a smaller goose that is found along the river in the winter. That's the one called the brant. Here you have a comparison of the brant and a Canada goose. You see it's smaller. It doesn't have that white patch on its cheek. It does have a little white patch on its neck. And I point this one out because in the winter you'll see them grazing down around the Battery, taking up young grass shoots, and they'll stay on through May, but towards the end of May, they start flying up to the tundra, and the flocks are very dense and very noticeable. They really follow the river. And in the Hudson River Almanac, which I mentioned, you'll sometimes see days on which successive observers will report flocks of brant from Westchester, then from Poughkeepsie, and then from Athens as these flocks move up the river, about the same number in each flock, probably looking at the same flock of birds moving up the Hudson, again in late May. And then there are the birds that are found in the marshes of the Hudson, the wetlands of the Hudson. The red-winged blackbird, of course, one of the most obvious. They arrive, some stay the winter, but they'll start showing up in the marshes depending on the progress of the weather in late February, early March. Great blue herons, again, a scattering of them through the winter, but they start showing up in March. Shorebirds, this is a killdeer, again, an early spring arrival, again, March probably for a lot of them. The marsh wren, another wetland bird found in the marshes of the Hudson, they arrive a little bit later, probably late April, early May. And more shorebirds come through in May. This is the least sandpiper. Again, as is the case with the waterfowl, although there are many species of shorebirds like the sandpiper and the killdeer that use the Hudson as a migratory route, very few of them actually stay and nest here. The killdeer is one, another called the spotted sandpiper is a second. And then there are, of course, the woodcock, but they're not so much along the river there in the uplands. Now, in talking about wetlands, another sign of spring that many people around here are familiar with are amphibians, the salamanders and the frogs calling, the spring peepers. And you might think that the wetlands of the Hudson would be a great place to go see them. That's not the case. If you think about it, amphibians they lay their eggs in the water, and those eggs need to stay wet. Given that the river is tidal, remember those slides I showed you an hour ago, those eggs might well be exposed to the bright sun and dry out in a tidal marsh. So there are not very many amphibians that are found in the Hudson's marshes. One that is occasionally is the green frog, and you'll sometimes hear it calling out in the marshes. But peepers, no, not so much. Salamanders, no. However, there are a fair number of reptiles out there, and I'll show you one, the snapping turtle. There are many of them in the Hudson River marshes. I've seen them all the way down to the Piermont Marsh, where the water gets a little salty, but they're quite common there. And again, later on in the spring, as almost at summertime, late May, early June, when you get a good soaking rain overnight, the snapping turtles will come out of the marshes and find some loose soil and start to lay their eggs. And they'll dig up a little pit, lay their eggs there, and then trundle back down to the marshes and stay there for the rest of the years. Many of the eggs are eaten by predators, by skunks and raccoons, things like that. But come the fall, or maybe even the following winter, you might see little snapping turtles headed back down. Actually, not the winter, the following spring, you might see the little hatchlings coming out of their nest and heading down to the water. One other sign of spring on the river is the appearance of the sloop Clearwater. That's something I look forward to every year. And unlike last year, the Clearwater will be sailing this year with people on board. COVID prevented that last year, even though it was out sailing about with just the crew. So we're looking forward to seeing them. And of course, they'll be carrying kids and students, and a smaller number than usual given COVID restrictions, but we'll be out there for some sails this spring. And I'd like to close by just mentioning a couple of resources that you might use to track what's happening over the season. The first is the Hudson River Almanac. This is a free weekly email, a newsletter that's sent out by email from the Hudson River Estuary Program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. It's compiled by a very fine naturalist, Tom Lake. He's been doing this for just about 25 years almost, a little longer than that now. And people who are out on the river, anglers, boaters, swimmers, birders, hikers, or just people who notice something in their backyard, even in the watershed of the river, will send observations to Tom Lake, and he'll put a selection of them into the weekly newsletter. And they may be about fish, it may be about birds. Tom's a big fan of eagles. You'll hear a lot about eagles, read a lot about eagles if you subscribe to the Almanac. But this is sort of typical, just a short piece of text that describes the observation. In this case, actually getting into the summer months, but I couldn't resist. How many people knew that there are cactus, prickly pear cactus, growing, they're native to the Hudson Valley and rocky, dry slopes, Palisades, even as far north as Hyde Park. But again, blooming flowers, arriving fish, birds, storms, just anything that interests observers along the river can be sent into Tom, and he'll put a selection of these in the Almanac each week. So if you do a search online for Hudson River Almanac, you can come up with subscription information for that. And I encourage you to subscribe, because it's a great way to follow the seasons through the river. And finally, again, returning to our graphs, the graphs that I showed you earlier were produced using the Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System. It's a great tool for those of you who really want to delve into the river. You can select from a number of stations that you'd like to get data from. You can select various parameters for weather or for water quality. You can select the time period you want to look at. You can go back and look at historical data, look at what happened when Irene and Sandy came through, for example, by choosing these specific date ranges. And then you just click on the graph, and there you get it. Now, I'm going to close by showing you one more graph. This one is a graph of water temperature, and it shows the water temperature in two places. One, the blue, is at the Port of Albany, and the red is on the west side of Manhattan, at Pier 84. That's about where the Intrepid is, on the west side of Manhattan. And as you started this period, you'll notice that pretty much what I would expect, given that the ocean is nearby and there's a lot more water down there, and it takes a long time for water to warm up in the spring, the temperature of the water down in New York City is cooler than the temperature. This was last week, Thursday, I guess it was. The temperature was a lot cooler in New York City than it was in Albany. But for some reason, the temperature in Albany started to cool off. And I wouldn't expect that, because it's spring and the fresh waters are warming. The land warms faster than the water. So I'd expect the little streams that are coming into the Hudson to be, to start warming up pretty quickly. And as they got to the Hudson, warm up the water temperatures there. But that's not what happened. So when I see this, it poses sort of a mystery. Why did that go on? And one of the great things about the Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System is that you can come up with a hypothesis, an answer to that mystery, and try different ones. In my case, I said, well, what happened back around the 15th that might have changed the trajectory of temperatures in the upper Hudson? If you'll remember, the 15th, last week, we had a cold rain. Actually, down here, it was a cold rain. Up in the Adirondacks and the Rensselaer Plateau, it was snow. And in western New England, it was snow. So if you think about that cool water working its way down into the river and coming over the dam at Troy and into the Hudson, cool down the river. That's my hypothesis. Well, what I did was to look at whether it did, in fact, precipitate in Albany on that day. And there you have it. You can see this is the orange here is rainfall or precipitation, a cold rain lasting over a couple of days, and subsequently the water temperature went down in the Hudson. So those are the sort of things you can explore using the Three-Coast Network. And I'm going to close with that, and I'd be happy now to take questions from anybody who's interested in asking them. So I'm going to stop my share and come back to gallery view.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I learned some new things, and I live with you.
I will share a story that many of you know that my wife and I both worked on the Hudson River. My wife for Scenic Hudson and myself for Clearwater for many years. And we would come home and talk about the latest developments in the PCB issue, for example. And there was one night when our older daughter, Margaret probably echoed her, said, Hudson River, Hudson River, Hudson River. All we ever hear about is Hudson River. We got to talk about something else. So we did. Anyway, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Okay. Yeah, and I will point out that was Alice talking, not me. So a question from Ed. Hi, Ed. I hope you're doing well. Is there a way to predict, this is going back to when you were talking about the tides and watching the tides on the Hudson. Is there a way to predict when the river is at its most calm so that kayaking is less risky?
Yes. One of the resources I didn't show you, but that is available, are tide tables. And they will tell you not only the height of the tide and when a high tide or a low tide is expected, but also when the currents will be switching directions. And of course, the current, if you're going to be kayaking out on the open river, you don't want to be fighting the current. You won't make much headway if you're doing that. These predictions are available from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And if you were to Google tides, Hudson River, NOAA, you'd probably come up with their predictions. You can also, of course, use HRICOS to see what's happening, not only in terms of the tides in real time, but also wind. If you were sailing, for example, or if you didn't want to go out on a day which is really windy, you could look at the weather forecast, but you could also go to the HRICOS, Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System station near where you wanted to kayak and look to see if there was a lot of wind at that site.
Okay, thank you. From Peggy, is the water chestnut indigenous to the Hudson?
No, the water chestnut was brought over to the United States, to New England, and then to the Mohawk. And it was put in a pond in the Mohawk River. The pond flooded, it got into the Mohawk and worked its way down into the Hudson. It's interesting, in accounts of water chestnut, you'll often see reference to an article that was posted in a botanical newsletter in the Boston area, saying essentially that such a beautiful plant could ever become a nuisance is hard to imagine. And of course, it's become quite a nuisance.
Yes. Okay. I'll give everybody a few minutes if you have any final questions or comments. I'm going to put it in the chat, the registration link for our upcoming program on the amazing American eel. I'm just going to point out this is a family program, so it's going to be accessible for kids. So if you know anybody who has kids locally, if you have grandkids who come and visit, you can come yourself. I encourage you to send that link out to them, get them to register. So I'm putting that link in. This recording will be available on our YouTube page, and I'll put the link to that. Everyone will receive, who registered, will receive a follow-up email with the direct link to the video. Another question from Ed. What is your opinion of the catfish that I often catch in the river?
Well, there are a couple of interesting things about them. First, don't eat them. They tend to be a fish that has fairly high levels of PCBs, so it's not wise to eat them. Secondly, the native species of catfish in the Hudson is something called the white catfish. But in the last 2 decades or so, the channel catfish has become much more common and has displaced the white catfish, particularly in the freshwater portion of the river. The channel catfish doesn't do as well in the saltier areas of the river, and the white catfish is more common down there. But the white catfish hasn't disappeared by any means, but now we see a lot more channel catfish in the river than we do white catfish in the freshwater river. How'd they get here? They probably came through the Erie Canal. They migrate. They're not native to the Hudson. They came from watersheds to the west of us through the Erie Canal.
Okay, a question. Hurricane Irene seemed to wipe out much of the Vallisneria in the Nori area. Has it made a comeback?
Yeah, the Vallisneria is that plant I showed you, the rooted vegetation, the water celery it's called, or SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation. It's the main one found in the river. Yes, it has come back. After Hurricane Irene, there was so much runoff from the watershed bringing with it mud. That the river, you see satellite photographs that show this brown strip coming through eastern New York State. And that was the Hudson River at that point. And that mud built up on the bottom of the river and prevented the young water chestnut plants, the tubers of the water chestnut, from poking their way up through the mud come spring and growing for several years following the storm. However, it has come back, and until the next big Irene storm hits, we'll have that plant out there producing oxygen and serving as great habitat for fish.
Are PCB levels in fish decreasing yet?
They're not. They decreased greatly after GE stopped dumping PCBs back in the 80s. They went down fairly steadily. There was a peak when additional discharges started happening from basically underground at the GE plants up in Fort Edward. The numbers, the concentrations of PCBs in fish tested up near where they've done the removal of PCBs in the upper Hudson. Some fish have gone down, some have gone significantly, some have gone down a little, some haven't changed much. The picture is a bit unclear. In the Hudson itself, although levels have gone down over the decades, so in general, yes, but they're still problematic depending on the species of fish, depending on where you fish, and depending on your sex and age. Basically, women of childbearing age and children are advised by the New York State Health Department not to eat most fish from the river. But again, that advice varies depending on the species and depending on where you are in the river.
Okay. A lot of people saying thank you. This was very informative. They're coming up with more questions. So if they see you out in the street, they're going to ask you. So be prepared. How will the closing of Indian Point affect the river?
The main way it's going to affect the river is that the power plants on the river suck in a lot of water to cool the plants. There's a lot of heat generated and when you burn oil or when you fire up a reactor, and basically that heat source creates steam, which drives the the turbines that produce the electricity from these plants. That steam has to be condensed, cooled down back to liquid water. And the way that's done is to bring in water from the river, which is much cooler, and to run it alongside in separate pipes the water that's circulating in the plant. And for the Hudson River power plants, instead of having cooling towers, at least the older ones, had no cooling towers. And so the hot water was discharged directly into the river. And given the amount of water needed to cool the reactors, the nuclear generating station at Indian Point, they killed a lot of fish because the very young fish and the larval fish were not able to swim against the current of water going into the plants. So many fish were sucked in and battered in the process of going through the cooling system. That was more the issue than the temperature of the water itself. That was a rather minor portion of the impacts on the Hudson. But with it shut down, no more cooling water intake and less fish kills.
Okay. I'll give people maybe one more minute. If you have any final questions, any final comments, we'll just start wrapping up. So thank you to everyone who came out and attended this program. Thank you to you, Steve, Dad,
you're welcome,
for coming out and doing this program for us. Hopefully we'll have the new edition of the Hudson on our shelves, either in our historical collection or out in the regular stacks where you can check it out. Yes, you can use your reactions to give a nice little applause. And we hope to have you back soon, whether it's on our screens talking about the Hudson or singing with Betty and the Baby Boomers or doing more family musical story times.
Okay. Well, thank you all for signing in, and I hope to see you on the river, if not on the streets of New Paltz. Take care, everybody.
Good night.